Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you for attending our session, The Future of End User Computing with Shawn Bass and Ryan Costello, sponsored by Sonnet.io. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dharmendra Mohan, CEO of Sonnet.io.
Hi, thanks everyone for attending the webinar. My name is Dharmendra Mohan, co-founder and CEO of Sonnet.io. For those who are not familiar, Sonnet.io is a cloud-native end-user computing solution that provides secure access to SaaS apps, private web apps, desktop applications, and virtual desktops. No need to deploy anything in end-user devices. Users access all their tools through their favorite browser. Our goal is to make it easy for IT to manage secure access to apps. IT can do that setup within an hour, anywhere globally, scale elastically, and onboard users in seconds. Zero trust security and visibility is built into the platform without requiring any additional security point solutions. You can visit sign.io for details. I'm excited to have the opportunity to host Ryan Costello and our advisor, Shawn Bass, veterans of end user computing. I'm looking forward to listening to their views on the future of end user computing, given the technical advancements in the cloud and emerging trends affecting the VDI industry. Over to you, Shawn. Thank you.
Thanks so much, DM. Appreciate the kickoff and welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm really excited to have a former colleague of mine, Ryan Costello, join me for this Future of End User Computing webinar. And I thought what we would do to kind of kick things off is, first of all, remind everyone, if you have any questions, please post them into the Q&A. Ryan and I will be discussing the future of end user computing for the first roughly 45 minutes. And then we will open it up to audience questions at the end. So if you think of something during the session, please feel free to post it in Q&A, and we will do our best to answer all the questions that you guys share out there. What I thought I would do is take a moment to introduce both of the panelists that you have today. So for those that are not familiar with me, my name is Shawn Bass. I've spent roughly 30 years in the end user computing space. I was most recently the CTO of end user computing at VMware end user computing business unit. I am currently a startup advisor, and I am advising Sonnet.io, who is the sponsor of this webinar. If you're not familiar with Sonnet, please check out their website and learn more about what they're all about. And I'd also like to turn it over to Ryan to introduce himself.
Thanks, Shawn. I'm Ryan Costello. I have worked in EUC for around 20 years or so. I spent about 9 years as an EUC architect at VMware. Starting out on Horizon, and then over the years, shifting focus to zero trust with Workspace ONE access and things like that. And for about the last 4.5 years, I've been the lead engineer for EUC solutions at Google Cloud.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So we've got a series of questions that you and I talked about that we want to discuss. And obviously, you being at Google, there's tons of things we can talk about in terms of modernizing in the cloud and zero trust. I mean, and Google has an amazing investment they've made with BeyondCorp, and we're going to touch on that a little bit later. But given that Google is one of the big three cloud providers, I think it would be awesome if we opened up with a discussion about organizations that are looking at their existing on-premises investments and trying to figure out how to get those into public cloud. Obviously, a lot of organizations looked at their infrastructure first. How do they modernize their applications and move them to the cloud? And then maybe they looked at their end user compute solutions a little later than that. But a lot of organizations are modernizing their EUC stack today. So I thought maybe we'd spend a little bit of time talking about how an organization plans their strategy of migrating to the public cloud. Is it a lift and shift migration? Are they really trying to transform their applications and make them cloud native? So I thought maybe I'd turn it over to you and kind of have you spend a little bit of time with the years you've been at Google. What are you seeing organizations do? What are the pros and cons of each approach? The success criteria, what experiences have you had that you can share with the group?
Yeah, definitely. So I think something that has a large effect on it is how mature you are on-prem with your current solution. So if you've been doing Citrix or Horizon for a really long time and have very mature deployments, usually that ends up being kind of a lift and shift. You basically have a really mature operational model. you understand how to manage your environment, and you really just want to extend that into cloud. A lot of those start as lift and shift. I think what people tend to discover, though, is the cost levers you have for optimization are different in cloud than what you have on-prem. And so on-prem, you can just run everything 24/7. And a lot of times it ends up being a density play, where the way you cost optimize is get as many virtual machines on each physical server as possible. Whereas you move into cloud, and it's much more, you pay for it while it's running. So power management becomes a really important factor that maybe you didn't consider before. So I think even in just a straight lift and shift, there's some element of transformation where you're looking at how do we operationalize this with different cost levers. I think if you're not really mature in a solution on-prem already, a lot of customers I work with look at that as a chance to, okay, all options are on the table. What do we want to look like in the future? And a lot of that has to do with from a lift and shift perspective. Are you lifting and shifting everything, or is part of this migration modernizing your applications too? And so that's where a lot of people are looking at more of a browser-based approach, and that can be a transformational shift for a lot of customers. That's what I see. I'm curious if that aligns with what you see too.
I think it does align very well. And you touched on power management as being a big deal. And obviously the clock's always running when a VM's powered out on the cloud, and you're paying per minute. So that's an important thing. I think another nuance of operational complexity that a lot of customers don't think through is the way you do maintenance also needs to be different. Obviously, if you're doing power management and you're only having the VM on for 8, 10, 12 hours a day that matches the user's usage pattern, then your maintenance processes also have to adhere to that process, because you're not going to be able to just fire off patches and updates and those kind of things in the evening like you would typically do in a large scale VDI environment where you cycle through patches. So all of that kind of operations process has to completely change. And a lot of organizations, I think, as they approach moving VDI to the cloud, exactly to your point, they also have to consider like what other stuff that we have on premises are we going to move to the cloud as part of this migration. And I think that really comes back to your comment about maturity model. If the organization is very mature and they understand their VDI environment inside and out, they can probably make a transition of the VDI tier or the RDSH tier to the cloud, and they'll know what the right applications are that they need to move along with their VDI stack, because they maybe have already done some assessment of their applications. Maybe they've already done wide area performance testing of their applications. Like sophisticated engineering organizations usually place things into VDI or into terminal services because it's a WAN and paired application, and they know it's better to co-opt the front end and the back end in the same data center location to provide the best performance for the application. But when you're moving to a situation where you're going to move the front end execution up into the public cloud and the back end is going to remain in your on-premises data center, now you got to take into account what performance impact that's going to have. Now, the big three cloud providers have points of presence all over the globe. So chances are they're going to have a data center pop somewhere near your headquarter data center location. But even if it is super close, you're still talking probably 15 to 35 milliseconds of latency at a minimum. And some applications will tolerate that just fine. Other applications may be severely impaired on their performance. It may be 10% slower. I've seen some applications that are, twice as slow as they were when they were co-opted front end and back end. So I think that's an important consideration people need to think through and really build their project plan accordingly for how they're going to deal with those back ends. Maybe they've got to move some of those back ends up to the public cloud at the same time as moving the front end.
That you just hit on. I mean, that's where I spend probably the majority of my time when working with customers, because you think about DAS in cloud, and one of the reasons why you move to that model is simplicity, not having to manage the control plane elements and things like that. And so a lot of the design work that goes into building a VDI deployment kind of gets shifted off your plate. But the part that very much still matters is exactly what you just touched on. And sometimes it's not immediately obvious, because people will say, "Oh, DAS, yeah, that's great. I can just put my workloads right next to my users wherever they are in the world, and it's super easy." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, that is true. You can do that. But if you're putting the desktop right next to the user, may not actually buy you anything if they're having to traverse the network to go back to the back end of the application." And so that usually ends up being a big part of the design conversation, is really understanding where your applications will live, where your users will live, and the different personas of those users. If you have a lot of end users that the applications they access are primarily live within the desktop, or they're just making calls out to the internet, um, yeah, sure, put your desktops right next to your users, and it'll probably be much better performance. But if they're accessing internal applications, I mean, like you mentioned, Google's network helps with some of that, but I mean, laws of physics still apply. If you have an application that today there's a millisecond between the front end and back end, and you suddenly have 20 milliseconds now, you don't really know how that's going to affect the application. So it's a huge consideration.
Now, you touched on something there that I want to go a little bit deeper on. You talked about, a modern approach to desktop as a service versus kind of a classic on-prem VDI RDSH stack approach. Could you spend just a moment talking about, what you mean? Because you talked about, certain things not being your responsibility. So maybe spend a little bit of time talking about kind of the legacy architectures versus the modern architectures, and what responsibilities you have in both.
Yeah, there's actually a slide that I love to use usually when I have this conversation, that kind of breaks down all the building blocks with, where the management lives, where the line, the demarcation point of, vendor managed versus customer managed. But just to kind of talk through it, I think desktop as a service is a bit of a spectrum. So on one side, you have completely on premises, where you're managing the physical hardware, you're managing the virtualization platform, you're managing the desktop or published app platform, and then the OS and everything on top of that. And then at the far other end of the spectrum, you have a completely managed service, where you're basically paying for a subscription, and you get access to a desktop that is provided, the OS and everything is provided by the vendor. And so, and then everything in between. So it kind of depends on your use case. I think for most of the customers I work with are tend to be on the large enterprise side. And so a lot of them are looking for solutions that take a lot of the administrative overhead off their plate, as far as they don't want to manage upgrades to the platform. They don't want to manage the physical infrastructure, but they want very granular control of policies, of the guest OS image, and things like that. And so I think, I don't think there's a one size fits all. I usually, the way I handle that is just try to understand the requirements of the organization, and then make a recommendation around, basically what you're trying to do. This would be a good fit. If you're a very small organization and you don't have a lot of admins to manage this stuff, something more managed is probably going to be really appealing. If you're a huge enterprise and you need very granular control, you're probably going to want something that gives you more knobs and dials to turn.
Got it. That makes sense. Last item I want to touch on in this topic about migration is, what about the end user devices? Obviously, if people have full-fledged workstations with, Windows, Mac OS, whatever, they can continue to use those to access your desktop as a service in the cloud, just like they used it to access their on-prem VDI environment. But, Google obviously has a ton of different offerings in this space, and one of the more prevalent kind of lightweight operating system offerings is, of course, Chrome OS. And you guys also have some conversion technology. So like, what are you seeing customers choose to do at the edge as they're rethinking where their desktops live?
Yeah, I think it depends on the use case. So I work with some customers that they use, VDI or published apps to augment what they're doing in the local OS. And so maybe they still they're going to keep deploying Windows, they're going to deploy Macs, and they just need VDI or published apps to present some specific applications, and that's fine. You have other customers that maybe traditionally they've been using thin clients, and some of them are moving to Chrome OS. Could be Chrome OS basically as a thin client. It could be Chrome OS where Chrome OS becomes the primary workspace, and if the majority of their apps are SaaS applications or web applications, and they just need to support a handful of Windows applications, they can just present those as published apps. There's also another option with Chrome OS Flex, where if you like the Chrome OS model, but you have a bunch of old hardware laying around, you can basically turn any old device into a Chromebox essentially, or a Chromebook, and use it that way. So it's kind of across the board. I will say Chrome OS is definitely a pretty good option when people are looking for cost optimization, but just to be honest, it doesn't fit every use case. So it's everything across the board.
Yeah, I think the kind of ultimate threshold there is probably how far that customer is on the journey to modernizing endpoint management. If they have a well-managed fleet that's modern managed, maybe the Chrome OS approach is less appealing to them because they already have a very cost-optimized endpoint management strategy. If they haven't done any of that and they're managing their devices in the classic way with PCLM style tools, then a conversion utility like Chrome OS Flex, or even just replacing with Chrome OS devices, becomes very compelling because it helps them compress the OpEx of managing those endpoints. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that. When you think about, like, PCs are cheap today, like it's $300, $500 for a PC. Well, most people don't realize that the operational cost to manage that device in its lifetime is typically 3 to 5x what the capital expenditure is to actually acquire it. So the real cost savings to obtain in doing a thin client or modern managed style endpoint approach is compressing that 3 to 5x OpEx down into something that's much more manageable. So yeah, appreciate the insights. Next topic we wanted to talk about was, what does it mean to be a platform? There's obviously a lot of vendors that call themselves a platform, both in the EUC space and in the data center and cloud space and endpoint management space and security space. Lots of companies claim to be a platform, but what does that truly mean to be a platform? And then the second question I would ask for you is, like, are platforms still valuable today? Like, is that a legacy way of thinking that I buy from one company and it's going to solve all my situations? Are people still interested in that, or are they looking for more best of breed and combining together their own solution? So let me hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that question is kind of a can of worms, because there's a lot of it depends there. So if you're all on premises today, and all of these components are things that you have to install and manage, and day 2 operations and updates and things like that, I think the idea of a platform is pretty appealing. I install this platform and I can use it for all my things. And I'll call myself out here. I mean, back in the early days, we would call something a platform that was basically like we had acquired some companies and started selling them together, and therefore it's a platform now. And I think everyone is kind of guilty of that. And that integration can take time, and so the word platform gets thrown around quite a bit. But assuming it is an actual integrated platform, these are tools that work together well, that have been integrated. I think in the right scenario, there's value there if you're managing it all yourself. Now, the flip side of that is kind of going back to the cloud conversation. If I'm doing all this in cloud and these are primarily SaaS services where I'm subscribing to it, and it's a managed control plane, and there's really no administrative overhead. I don't have to install anything or manage anything. It becomes much easier to sort of say, I'm going to use this, and this best of breed point solution to create kind of the bespoke EUC environment I want. That's harder to do on-prem, I think, because there's a lot of cost advantages to buying big platforms together, but then you sort of are tied to the capabilities of that platform. So you sort of have to build your operations and your environment around the capabilities of a platform. Whereas when you can move towards a more of that bespoke model, you can sort of pick and choose the tools that support your operational model. So I think either one could be a valid approach, but it really depends on the environment.
Yeah, I think if we look at the EUC space in particular, a lot of the big vendors in EUC have acquired technologies that they have made part of their platform offering. And I think you touched on a really good point earlier, which is to say, is it a platform in name only, or are these technologies truly integrated where it's plug and play? And if it's not truly plug and play, then the onus is on the customer to integrate and lifecycle manage those technologies. And I think you touched on another really good point, which is the offering that is in that platform truly going to meet the requirements of the organization, or is it merely a feature that satisfies 60 to 80% of what you need? Because if you are really dependent on that capability, let's call it app layering or persona management or whatever it is, if it's not the best in class offering that's going to meet all of your needs, you're either going to integrate what the vendor provides and then still have to acquire another tool to cover the edge cases that are not covered by that tool, or don't even use the platform provided offering and just go acquire third party and plug it in. But there's a cost with each of those decisions, either in terms of feature and functionality or added cost and operational expense to manage it. So I think you're touching on a couple of really good points. Is the technology in that specific space going to meet all your requirements? Yes or no? And then what's the added cost of you having to go outside the platform and use a third party in that circumstance? So excellent point. The other thing I want to say is, like as customers mature in their vendor selection in moving to more platform, or I shouldn't say platform, I should say SaaS style approaches. One of the things that I've observed in the last probably 5 to 10 years is organizations are starting to have a more difficult time articulating to the financial folks in their organization, the CFO, and even some cases the CIO, that the return on investment or the time to value of their platform investments are a good investment of money and time. Because a platform play is great if you can tick 6 boxes of technologies that you need. But if implementing all 6 of those capabilities in the platform is going to take you 36 months, you may wear thin on the patience of your CFO or CIO that it's going to take you 36 months to get the return on investment of that money that you spent. So I have been seeing a trend in customers where the platform style approach you would think resonates, but and on feature, value calculations it does, but it doesn't in the time to value factor in that equation. And some customers are saying, we don't have 36 months to implement this and get that return on investment. Are you seeing similar things?
Yeah, I think the maybe slight nuance in cloud is it depends a lot on if the customer has if they've already adopted that platform on-prem. So let's, use one of the big platforms for an example. Let's say they've, fully operationalized app layering and workspace environment management and things like that. If they're already doing that on-prem, bringing it to cloud is pretty simple, and you can show value right away. I work with a lot of different vendors in this space, and so another one I work with a lot, their platform is more bring your own management. And so if I'm a customer looking at both of these, if I've already operationalized all of those things and I just want to bring it to cloud, there may be a good TCO there. I may be able to see that ROI right away because I already know how to use those things. Whereas a bring your own management, sometimes I think people look at that as a negative of like, oh, it doesn't have all the same features. But if you're not planning on using them, so for example, let's say I use Intune to manage all my physical fleet of laptops and desktops, and now if I can deploy a DaaS platform really, really quickly and efficiently and just extend the way I'm managing my physical devices to my virtual devices, that's actually a much faster, time to value than trying to fully implement a platform.
Yeah.
So it kind of depends on where you're at and what your goals are.
Got it. It's good feedback. All right, so the next one is EUC as a mission critical infrastructure and why you made to rethink some aspects of this. So I'm really glad that you actually suggested this topic, because having been in the EUC space for 30 years, I always spend a lot of time trying to convince people how important the EUC technologies are to the satisfaction of the employees and the serviceability of them doing their jobs. But sometimes EUC isn't really in sort of the top 5 or top 10 priorities for IT leadership. So I want to get your thoughts on why EUC is mission critical infrastructure and why organizations need to rethink their approach to EUC.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. It's often overlooked, and it's frustrating to me because if I'm working with an organization, or maybe a team internal to Google, and we were talking about a migration, and I suggested to them, hey, you know what, databases are kind of hard, let's just leave your database on-prem and move the rest of it, because the rest of it's really easy. I would get laughed at. They would say, what are you talking about? That's not going to work. And there's a perception that the access tier is not at the same criticality as the rest of the application stack. And my argument is it is equally important. If your users can't access these applications in a performant, secure way, that affects the entire application, the whole reason why we're running these applications. And so your EUC infrastructure has to be on equal footing with your entire estate, all of your application infrastructure, your databases, your data, all of that. Your end user computing should be in that same conversation. And so what I frequently run into on migrations that have stalled or in some cases failed is where a large scale migration was being planned and the end user computing team was not involved. And so the people in charge of the migration said, we'll worry about that part later. We're going to focus on our mission critical stuff first. We're going to make sure that's designed properly and that the migration is successful. And then at some point in the future, when we get time, then we'll think about the EUC side of the house. And that's just a recipe for failure. Best case scenario, let's say you have a really successful migration. And back to our earlier point, now we've introduced 20, 30, 40 milliseconds of latency between the front end and back end of the application. We can have a really, really well-designed VDI environment. We can have a perfectly executed migration, but the perception of the end users is, this is terrible. Why do my applications perform so badly now? So it doesn't matter that it was all done correctly. The end result is a failed migration. And so what I always try to explain to people and try to position is, your EUC technology can actually be the driver for the enabler for a successful migration. I mean, most of these solutions are user-based licensing. So we can deploy infrastructure wherever we need to. And for example, as we start building a plan for migrating applications, if we build a parallel, VDI or published app environment in cloud and just change a user's entitlement as we migrate those applications, through that entire migration lifecycle, we can ensure that that end user has optimal connectivity to their applications. And that's how you do it really successfully. But this whole idea that EUC is somehow less important and is something you can sort of kick that can down the road and we'll get to it when we have time, your migration is going to be very, very difficult.
I think you touched on a really important point there, that if you don't co-opt the EUC access tier as part of your initial design, you may find yourself at the end of the project having successfully migrated your applications to the cloud, but then your end users are saying the performance is terrible. Like, why is this so bad? And, like you articulated it as like a failed project, and it's failed in terms of user satisfaction and performance and that kind of stuff. But the more important thing to me is that when you finally reach the stage where you think your project is complete, now you find yourself having to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, what do we have to change now with the EUC access tier to turn this into a user acceptable performant environment? And you may have caused yourself months of new project time, in addition to tons of additional cost. Whereas if that we took the approach that you advocate for, which is make the EUC access tier part of the initial scope of the project, and that you're planning for that all along, then you find yourself having articulated that in the project plan, designed for it, and come out with satisfied users and not having a project overrun both in time and budget. So I agree with you. I think if the IT teams that are leading their cloud migration projects aren't working with the end user computing team and the access layer, they might find their entire project has failed or run severely over because they didn't take into consideration that aspect of the performance of access to those applications. So spot on. I couldn't agree more. Now, I did want to ask, I want to make a point about this, that I think that EUC access technologies in general could be one of those things that actually helps you make sort of what I call like a stepwise cloud migration strategy. Because if you're taking into account the user access tier and you say, hey, we know that this application is going to not be performant unless we move the back end at the same time as the front end, you can actually find your EUC access design is starting to drive more application cloud migrations that you might have not even had in scope as part of your application modernization project. But the EUC access tier is actually helping you force more of those applications to the cloud as part of that project implementation. So, taking into account the EUC access layer can actually help you accomplish more of your app modernization efforts.
100%. I mean, you took the words right out of my mouth. I say that constantly. It's there's this chicken and egg problem that I think people approach this problem where they say it's too much effort to move my whole VDI environment or published app environment and my whole application and infrastructure at the same time. So I'm going to try to take this as a phased approach. And I can understand the logic there of trying to not bite off more than you can chew at once. But I think that decision is made by people that maybe don't typically think about end user experience. If you're designing applications or you're a network engineer or things like that, obviously you care about availability and performance and manageability and all these things. But there's a certain aspect of user experience that only exists in end user computing. And so if you're someone who manages a VDI environment today, you know how critical you can have great boot times, you can have, awesome performance, but there are little things related to user experience that are harder to quantify that an end user can consider maybe not a failed deployment, but I don't want to use this. It isn't,
Yeah.
I don't, and so if a user doesn't want to use it from a business perspective, I mean, you can consider that a failed migration. And so that's exactly what you just mentioned is what I always try to convince people to do is use the EUC solution as a stepwise migration tool where we can, as we're ready to move these components, now it just becomes a simple entitlement change, and app by app, we can ensure that each one is successful. It's just over and over and over. I've seen that be the successful model for
I think talking about entitlement is so important because what most people don't think through is when you have some form of a workspace aggregator where you can flip applications on or off in different data centers or on-prem and cloud, it makes it so trivial for you to be able to have an app that's running on-prem today, you migrate the infrastructure to the cloud, you turn off the on-prem entitlement, you turn on the cloud entitlement, and you go. And the best part about that aggregation strategy is if anything's wrong in the cloud, it's simply an entitlement change to switch back to on-prem and keep going. So it's a really powerful strategy for getting things to the cloud in a very efficient manner. All right. Next one I want to talk about is with the increase in bring your own device that's been happening in the enterprise over the last 10, 15 years. The question now is, do you start to care more about the security of the browser than you do about the security of the endpoint as a whole? Because more and more things are getting access from the browser, both web and SaaS apps where important business critical data is being utilized. And of course, we can use the browser to access our VDI or published apps. So is the shift around endpoint management starting to get more focused on browser security than it is on holistic endpoint security, especially when we're doing more and more BYOD, where we may not be able to do full-fledged endpoint security?
I don't know if I would go so far as to say it's more important, but it's enabling a lot of new use cases where, I talk to a lot of organizations that maybe historically for external contractors, they ship them a device or something like that. And even in, highly secure environments where even if they're just providing a VDI desktop, they need to do, some type of, device posture check on the local physical device before allowing access. And if you're doing that at the device level, sometimes that can be challenging. Sometimes it's the right approach. Sometimes, your use case requires that. But being able to do, context-based security, device posture checking just from the browser, I think opens up so many additional use cases. It's another tool in the tool belt, and most of these things can work pretty well together where you can say, all right, I'm going to provide, my end users a secure browser, and that's their primary way of accessing the environment. And then you can apply security policies based on SaaS or web-based applications, or maybe the user needs a VDI desktop or a published app or something, and you can deliver that just in the browser or to the local device if it's required. And so I don't know if the browser is becoming more important, but it's definitely enabling a lot of use cases that used to be really challenging.
Yeah, I think we talk about the idea of shipping a device. To go back to a point I made earlier, I think if an organization is far enough along in their endpoint modernization, where they're doing cloud management with modern management APIs, not doing classic imaging and PCLM style management, then the idea of shipping a secure device to the user becomes far simpler because they can do a drop ship provisioning, they can do all the cloud provisioning, all that kind of stuff. It becomes very easy. If an organization is not on that side of the modern endpoint management, then it becomes a much bigger challenge because it may be weeks before they can get an asset out to a new user. And in particular, when you're dealing with like third-party contractors, this becomes a very difficult gray area because maybe you don't want to ship a corporate device to a third-party contractor for liability reasons and those kind of things. Like you want to have them using their own endpoint, but if they're using their own endpoint, what level of security can you provide? Like you're probably not putting your endpoint protection or EDR technology down on their device, again, for liability reasons. So that's where I said, like in some use cases, being able to do some endpoint interrogation, device attestation, context-based security policies, those kind of things, it starts to bring about a bigger focus, I think, on the browser and what level of things we can interrogate from the browser. And obviously the browsers today don't give us a ton of information that we can gather from them. There is a new class of enterprise browsers from a number of different vendors, purpose-built vendors like Island and Talon and those guys, but also obviously Microsoft and Google have been doing their own investments in the enterprise browser space. And what's exciting about that market is more and more companies are starting to recognize that you're going to have to offer more from the browser to be able to interrogate the device posture and the security context of the browser than what you were able to do in the past with the typical browser extension. So being able to query more intelligence from the browser about the endpoint security is becoming a more commonplace thing in this class of enterprise browsers. And I think that for BYOD driven use cases, this may be the way that you need to do things is interrogating the endpoint through the browser, because you're not going to end up putting all of your endpoint security technologies on those devices. So maybe that's a good use case for contractors and third parties. Maybe it's even a use case that you use to onboard some of your work from home people that want to use their own personal devices, that you got to at least have some level of attestation of those devices before you're going to let them in. While we're on this topic, I think maybe it makes a lot of sense for us to transition to the last topic, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A. Zero trust security as it applies to end user computing. So we've already kind of touched on some things like device attestation, context-based security policies, identity aware proxies, and all those kind of things. Maybe touch on a little bit, like Google's been investing in zero trust, probably one of the earliest companies investing in zero trust with their BeyondCorp initiative. So maybe if you wouldn't mind spending a couple minutes talking about kind of the origins of BeyondCorp and why this kind of came about at Google.
Yeah, maybe a lot of people have already heard of this. There's actually some great books about it, but Operation Aurora back in like 2009, huge nation state cyber attack, hit a lot of US companies. Google is one of them, Adobe, Morgan Stanley, like a bunch of big companies got hit with this. And so back then, Google sort of made a decision to, from the ground up, completely rethink how we do internal access. And the result of that was a series of white papers called BeyondCorp, which is, basically short for Beyond the Corporate Perimeter. And so the idea was to everything, we talked about device attestation, context-based security, everything using the browser as the control point, without the need to do VPNs. And so that was, Google's internal implementation of it existed for a long time. And basically we, provided a framework for how we did it. And that became really a lot of what we think of as zero trust concepts today that are sort of table stakes, all started with that BeyondCorp initiative within Google. So Google has definitely been, a key driver of these types of technologies since, their earliest versions. And it's interesting, like at the beginning of this, I talked about, I spent several years doing zero trust back at VMware. And back in those days, I would go into customers, and people may already be doing VDI or some of these technologies. And we would talk about zero trust. And a lot of times it was something that you had to convince people, like, this is something you should be doing. This is, This is, the idea is create a more seamless experience for the end users while providing better levels of control around DLP and device posture and things like that. And so but it was new. It was something that it wasn't, really common yet, or it was very hard to implement. And the thing that's interesting now is, well, you and I talked about this. I mean, zero trust is one of those things like cloud or AI. It's like it's one of those buzzwords that everyone has their own definition of.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult to say, what a zero trust solution is exactly. I think we can probably all agree on some common principles that apply to zero trust. But these days, I don't have to convince anyone that zero trust is a good idea. It's sort of assumed. If I go talk to a customer, it's sort of assumed that they're trying to implement some level of zero trust, policy in their organization.
Yeah, and one of the things that we didn't touch on as we're discussing aspects of zero trust, but it reminded me of this when you said moving away from VPNs. Organizations used to let everyone VPN into the network and had very loose policies on what the users could get to once they were VPN'd. And this was just a huge risk, because if a device became compromised, the attacker sitting on that device had carte blanche access to the entire data center network. And then the responsibility got shifted to the NOC and the SOC to basically identify a compromised device that was launching attacks internally and then try to quarantine it off in the network. And in reality, what we needed to be thinking about all along was microsegmentation. Like, how do we restrict what an end user can get to so it's only a microsegment of one between the application on their endpoint device and the resource they're trying to talk to in the data center? And that's effectively what an identity-aware proxy really does, is create this microsegment between an app sitting on an end user's device and a resource in the data center, but it cannot access anything else. So if you implement microsegmentation or application-aware proxy or identity-aware proxy, it gets you to a point where you don't have to worry about your remote users ever launching an Nmap attack on your data center network, because they just can't get to the data center network from an end user device, even if they compromise an end user device. So, there's lots of different ways to implement zero trust. You called out, it's a very overloaded term, and there's probably 100 different things you can do to move forward on zero trust. And one of the things that I always try to encourage customers of VMware when I was there, because I was very passionate about zero trust and trying to push the VMware technologies forward on zero trust, is it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. Like, if you take a look at your personas in your organization, let's say you have 8 different persona types and you've got a traveling executive with a laptop and a handful of applications or whatever. If you look at the things that they use on their device and just pick one application that's used by a vast majority of your users in your enterprise, and use zero trust enable that one application access, move it to an identity aware proxy, microsegment the traffic, do some device attestation, context aware security policies. If you just zero trust enable one app used by 10,000 users, you've made your estate infinitely more secure from an attacker's point of view. And that's really what we're trying to do in security, is keep raising the bar for the attacker to either make it more expensive in time or money to compromise one of your end users or compromise your data center. The reality is you don't have to implement every single security control in zero trust for 100% of your users and 100% of your apps. Every single one that you enable gets you that much more secure in the eyes of an attacker. And that's really what we're after, is just making it more expensive or more time consuming to compromise your environment. So I always talk to customers about zero trust being a journey, that you just have to take action today on zero trust enabling one app or one use case or one persona. And that will, it will make significant inroads and compound the benefit of the investment of time in zero trust. Like, people don't have to look at it like, it's going to cost us $20 million in 3 years to zero trust enable our infrastructure. Like, just take action on one app or one persona and start modernizing your approach. and that will pay dividends in terms of the security posture.
That's the exact approach I used to use when I was, working with customers to implement this stuff. Is there's a lot of, sometimes implementing these types of solutions, you get this, analysis paralysis where you're looking at your entire estate and going, you're trying to, do everything at once, and it's not feasible. And I would always take the approach of, success breeds success, and we start with a couple applications and make the user experience amazing and show what we can do from a security policy perspective. And what's funny is we would do these internal pilots and other users would start to see people, where they don't have to put in their password anymore. They have this really smooth login experience and security is happy. And people would start going, hey, how do I get access to that? And then you start having app owners going, hey, what do we need to do to enable our apps for this stuff?
It becomes a pull instead of a push.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right. Well, we're going to jump into some Q&A. Got a couple of questions here I want to ask you. So I'll take a first stab at this one, and then Ryan, I'll turn it over to you to get your thoughts. So the question is, we are primarily on premises today. I'm assuming they're talking about their EUC solution. Oh yeah, but they're thinking of doing DAS in the future. What's the most important things for us to know about this move? Like, what are the critical success factors? So I would say in general, when you're looking at an on-premises VDI to DAS migration, you don't really need to think about treating it that much differently than you would, let's say, an OS platform migration for your existing on-premises VDI environment. You're moving from one OS to the other. All the same concerns and considerations, generally speaking, come into mind. At the end of the day, I'll tell people you have to know your apps. You have to know everything about your applications, how to install them, how to manage them, OS compatibility, any considerations in the new target OS that you need to think about. The only thing I would say, and we touched on this earlier in the webinar, is you need to know how latency sensitive your applications are, because if you're moving them from an on-prem data center where everything's high-speed LAN connected on 10 gig Ethernet or 100 gig Ethernet, and then you're going to move it to the cloud, you're going to introduce a latency separation, and that's something that could make or break applications. Some apps will not have any noticeable performance difference. Some could be orders of magnitude slower. From my experience, anything that uses a SQL or Oracle or ODBC connection is going to be terrible because they're very chatty on the WAN. So if you've got something using SQL or Oracle or some form of ODBC database connectivity, those are the ones that I'd be highly suspect as to whether or not they're going to be performant when you move the front end to the cloud. You may need to plan to move the back end as well. And much like I tell you in doing an on-premises VDI or terminal server implementation, like you can do simulated WAN connectivity with a ton of different vendors' technologies to be able to determine like, hey, if we throw 30 milliseconds of latency at this, how is this thing going to perform? And you can test that in your existing network and know before you even move the front end how that thing is going to perform. So do some user acceptance testing over your simulated WAN link and get your user to say, hey, is this acceptable or is this terrible? And even maybe clock the performance of the before and after so you know how much degradation is going to be there before you even plan the migration of that front end to the public cloud. So Ryan, anything else you want to add to that?
I think you covered pretty much all of it. I guess the only other thing I would add, we touched on this earlier, but cost optimization is different on-prem than it is in cloud.
Great point.
That's definitely something to think about. If you're doing a pure lift and shift, and you're just going to pick up your environment exactly as is and move it to cloud and have everything run all the time, you hear stories of people moving to cloud and it being horribly expensive, and then they had to try to find a way to move back to on premises.
Yeah.
That's usually the reason why. If you take an on-prem operational model and just drop it in cloud, you're paying a premium for not having to manage hardware anymore, for having a lot of elasticity and things like that. And so, with that comes, looking at a different model for power management. And so I would definitely say that is something to be keenly aware of, is understand when do your desktops, when do your RDSH servers need to be running? I mean, every major platform has pretty great controls for being able to power on and off on a schedule, or suspend VMs when they're not in use. And so it's not like you have to reinvent the wheel and figure this all out yourself.
Yeah.
Tools are there, take advantage of them, and then that's
So
how you
back to planning. Make sure you're planning for this so you don't have sticker shock when your first cloud consumption bill comes in. It's an excellent point.
Yep.
Next question. So VDI and desktop as a service in general had a huge surge during the pandemic. What effect has that had on the enterprise's EUC strategy in the years following, since the pandemic has, I don't think we ever say has gone away, but has kind of subsided and things have gone back to normal? So Ryan, give me your thoughts on that.
I think it depends on where you started. So I worked with a lot of customers in the very early time during that period. And if they already had like a super mature Horizon environment or Citrix environment, and they were either they were doing an on-prem expansion of it, or it became really hard to get hardware during that time. So that's where a lot of, cloud VDI deployments really took off. But if you're very mature in that model and you're just kind of doing an extension, it was pretty easy. And I've seen a lot of customers, just based on whether they permanently implemented a work from home strategy, a lot of them have just kind of kept going down that path. Some of them have, as workers have gone back to work, they've said, okay, this cloud burst that we needed during this time, we don't really need anymore. So we're going to pull it back in. The other end of the spectrum, I worked with a lot of customers that were caught completely off guard, and they didn't already use any solution like this. And so they were completely new to VDI, trying to just do some quick and dirty way to get their users remote access. And that's been really hit and miss. So I've seen customers that had a great experience there that have said, hey, this worked well for us. Now let's mature it. Now that we've got some time, let's sort of rebuild this as the way we want it to be going into the future. Others have taken the opposite approach of like, this was a Band-Aid solution that, it got us through this period, but, now we've gone back to work and we're going to switch back to how we used to do things. So but I've definitely seen some customers that it had a major effect on their overall strategy, because it was just something they hadn't considered before. And since then, now they've really rethought how they do end user access.
Well, I think you're touching on a really important point. It's something that I observed with customers who, exactly as you said, had a mature on-prem VDI implementation, but because of hardware capacity issues and nobody was able to get servers, they were forced to put desktops in the cloud. And I think what's really interesting about that is a lot of the internal IT teams that managed the existing on-prem VDI implementation, a lot of them were kind of cloud naysayers, like, oh, our environment's too complex, it's too hard, there's too many on-prem apps that we access, and this will never work in the public cloud, like we can't do DAS. And what the pandemic showed a lot of these companies is like, you can, and you did, and it worked, and maybe it wasn't perfect, but it was 90% what you needed. And maybe they had to make a couple of modifications on the fly, like, oh, this app doesn't perform well in DAS, so we got to reverse publish it out of the on-prem, RDSH environment. But a lot of customers recognize that they can actually run their desktops in the cloud. And so I think that's been an interesting accelerator for desktop as a service, even post-pandemic, that customers that were being told by their internal IT teams they couldn't do desktop as a service are now finding out they can. And so they're actually increasing their movement for a variety of reasons. Sometimes data center evacuation, sometimes cloud is part of their strategic planning, whatever the case may be. Customers have learned that, we were being told by our ops team we couldn't do it. Now we found out we could because we had to. And now it's opening our eyes that there's more opportunity there for us to continue to move desktops that are on-prem up into the public cloud. So I think that's opened a lot of people's eyes. Tell you what, I know we are at time. Thank you all for your attendance. Thank you for your questions. Ryan Costello, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.